Mulla perceived that there was a possibility of awakening a modicum of spiritual awareness in his neighbor. So he offered to impart to him some mystical teachings. And his neighbor said, "Oh, Mulla, any time at all, just come over to my house and I'll be very glad to listen to you." So the Mulla realized that he did not understand at all. So he had to await his opportunity. And then there was a chance, because one day his neighbor was up on his roof while the Mulla was out in his yard, and his neighbor called down, "Mulla, Mulla, my charcoal is going out, I need you to blow." And the Mulla shouted back at him, "My breath is at your disposal, just come over any time you like and I'll give you some." And then there's that wonderful story about the great Hindu king. He had all the riches in the world, great palace, a resplendent kingdom, but of course he was always in battle, keeping the marauding invaders away from his borders. So he was constantly at war. But one day, after a very fierce battle, returning with his weary army to his own kingdom, he came to the forest at the edge of his realm. And as he entered that forest, suddenly a great wave came over him, seeming to lift the burdens, the weariness, the responsibilities. And as he moved deeper and deeper into that forest, and all of those burdens that he had carried fell away, not only did he feel this peace, but his sensory awareness was flooded with the harmony surrounding him, the sound of the birds, the wind in the trees, melding into a great symphony that seemed to fill him. He suddenly realized that he was in the domain, in the ashram of the great saint Vasistha. Now, moving deeper and deeper into the forest, suddenly they came to a clearing. And in that clearing, surrounded by trees, and under each tree, there sat a sage in deep meditation. The king left his army and entered the clearing. And there, in its midst, there was the simple hut of the great saint himself, sitting cross-legged outside his door, as was his usual wont, in a deep state of meditative peace. But as is the way with such beings, nothing invaded his space. So when the king came forward and prostrated himself, the sage's eyes opened, and he rose and welcomed the king, inviting him to be seated, requesting that platters of the delicious fruit that grew on the trees was brought to him. And the king and the saint spent many hours in deep conversation. And as the day wore on, the king realized that he had to take his leave. His duties called. He had to take his army back to his palace. But just as he was about to take his leave, the great saint said to him, "Wait, wait, your army is tired and hungry. Let me entertain them." Oh, the king said, "It's a great horde of soldiers. There are too many. It would be too great a task." "No, no, 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 no," said the saint. "Call them here." So the king called his army, a great army, to gather around in the clearing. And then, quietly, the great saint seemed to whisper, "Subhuti, Subhuti, come." And just then, the air around the saint seemed to flutter and expand. And then suddenly particles came together, and there, beside the great saint, was a cow, her eyes shining. Anyone looking into them, it seemed that the sun and the moon and the stars shone from them, her great horns rising up to the heavens almost, or seemingly so. And the saint said, "Subhuti, we have guests, care for them." And suddenly each of the soldiers found that they had the food of their heart's desire in front of them, and everyone partook fully of the delights of that which was provided for them. The king was overwhelmed. Never had he seen or experienced anything like this before, and a great sense of covetousness arose in him. So after the feasting, the king said to the saint, "How much do you want for this cow? I will offer you whatever you ask of me." The saint said, "You don't understand. Subhuti, this cow arises out of the purity of a sage's soul. She cannot be given, she cannot be sold." But the king was adamant. He wanted this cow. So he bargained, but to no avail, until he got angry. And he said, "Then if you won't give her to me, I will take her." So he ordered his army to come forth. But of course, as they did, Subhuti disappeared just as she had appeared, the particles separating themselves and returning to from whence she came. The king was angry, and he said, "If you won't give her to me, I will kill you." But then, as the army approached the great saint blew his breath, and the army was turned to dust. The king was abashed, angry, and taking his leave, he vowed that he would return and kill this saint. He went back to his kingdom, but all he could think of was the revenge. And so he left his son in charge of his kingdom, and he went into the forest to seek out a sorcerer from whom he could learn all the arcane arts of creation. And after some time, when he had acquired what it could be believed are all the weapons that such a one can acquire from the occult realms, he set out to go back into the forest to take his revenge on the great saint. When he arrived, there was the saint in his usual position outside his hut, sitting tranquil and serene. But then the king approached and immediately let forth to the great sage a blast of one of his occult weapons. And immediately the hut ignited in flames, burning up around the great saint. But after the smoke had cleared, to the great surprise of the king, there was the saint standing, his loincloth still smouldering, his hair singed, but standing tall, holding a wooden staff. The king, surprised but laughing at the state of the saint, began to let forth his other weapons, but which with each the saint merely held up his staff, and the weapon was defrayed. Weapon after weapon after weapon, until the last that the king had in his occult arsenal was let forth. And it seemed that the staff that the saint was holding merely opened up and swallowed whatever it was that was sent forth from these earthly arsenal of weapons. But then the king was so angry. But then also was the saint aroused, and the saint, standing, said to the king, "You have come to destroy my peace, so I will have to destroy you." And he held up his staff, but suddenly all of the sages who were sitting under the trees rose up and said, "Vasistha, do not let your peace be disturbed." And suddenly it seemed that the sage came back to an awareness, and taking his staff and aligning it in front of his body, he returned to his state of serenity. And looking at the king, he said, "Go, and may the fire of your anger bring you to spiritual realization and peace." The king returned to his palace, and at first, recognizing that he was vanquished by a staff, he realized that in not being able to take or acquire this, that all that was left for him to do was to find it for himself. So the question that might be asked of us, what is this stuff? What is it that you use to align yourself? When there's turbulence, your mind, you're confronted with some difficulty, challenge. What is it that we use to align ourselves? What is our stuff? What is it that cannot be given?
The breath.
We might say that we could give someone that resuscitation, CPR, isn't it? But are we giving life, or are we reigniting life? What is it we cannot give? And yet we give with it.
Our true essence.
If we ask ourselves and can answer the question, what is this stuff that we have? We can begin to recognize the power of not only what it is, but what it does. And in so doing, we come to know who we are and what we do. It's so simple. What is this stuff?
Well, one thing I noticed in the story was that when the sage actually needed help, he had the support of his community, and they reminded him of his basic principle. And having that support is really important. Yeah, so that's one aspect. And the other one